Morning, friends. Let's flip over to Acts chapter 23. We're going to pick up where we left off last week with Paul on his journey. One of the things that's difficult, and I talked a little bit about it a couple weeks ago, is in these last chapters, everything's moving really fast. And if you were to sit down, and if you have the time and the patience, I encourage you to sit down maybe and kind of read from like Acts 19, 18, just through the end of the book, because all of a sudden it just becomes Paul's doing this and he's going here and this is happening and that's happening. It really kind of gives you a good flow of what Paul's going through in this last portion. And the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest and people visiting him. And then eventually Emperor Claudius will kind of go out of the picture. Emperor Nero will take over and Nero will behead him. But it's just during this time, as we looked at, especially last week, he's just constantly being jostled and pulled back and forth by the Jews and the Romans, and just complete craziness. And really what I want to kind of focus on today as we look through this, there's almost two layers to each one of these stories. There's just the kind of what's happening and the flow of the story, as it were. And then there's kind of some underlying ideas and ways that maybe we can deal and work through our own lives. And, one of the things that we're going to look at today is, and I even kind of outlined it out in a little bit of a crude outline, is in this portion especially, there's ups and there's downs, which I think is very much like life. Now, most of us probably aren't in danger of a Jewish Sanhedrin trying to hunt us down and put us to death for the sake of the gospel, but on lesser ways and in lesser ways, you might have noticed that life can have these huge highs and everything is great, and then there's this low and everything's terrible, and then, something good happens and something bad happens, and it kind of ends up like this. And when you see Paul, and when we read through Paul, what we're starting to see is that he doesn't seem to be responding in that way. He doesn't seem to be constantly responding to the circumstance with an emotional and a scared response. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to just stand up here and say, don't have emotions and just be glad for everything that happens. That's not really a real human experience. But what can be a real human experience is the ability to consider what's happening, weigh it against who God is and what he's doing and his promises, and then move forward regardless, right? Which I think that's what most of us are looking to do. That's what Christian maturity is when we grow up and we're able to evaluate our circumstances, not on our resources or our knowledge or anything like that, but more on the resources of what Christ has done in our lives and what he wants to do in our lives and what he's able to do. So we're going to pick up, if you don't mind, in chapter 23 and in verse 11. Now remember, up to this point, he's gone through kind of an impromptu Sanhedrin meeting. He stands up in the middle of it, realizing that it's going to be kind of a joke of a proceeding. He's going to be convicted, and he just shouts that he's on trial for the resurrection of the dead. So remember, last week we talked about that. The Pharisees are like, oh, clearly this guy has it together. We believe in the resurrection of the dead. And then the Sadducees are like, no, there's no angels. There's no resurrection of the dead. We don't buy into this guy. So they begin to kind of assault one another and attack. And apparently there's some concern about Paul. And so the Romans go back down and pull him out of the mess that he's in. And then the following night, there in verse 11, chapter 23 and verse 11, it says that the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. Now, this encouragement, remember, and we mentioned this last week, the idea of take courage or take heart or be of good cheer, it's translated those ways in different translations for English, is given by Jesus. That encouragement is given by Jesus 8 or 9 times in the New Testament to the disciples all over the place, and in different times when they're going through difficult times. Now, for here, what an encouragement it must have been through Paul, but I think there's 2 ways to look at it as an introduction for what we're going into. Number 1, he's guaranteed safety, at least for a time. And this is something that I wrestle with a lot because I want to be a positive person, right? And I want to be an encouraging person. But there's something that's really important about God's encouragement that I just can't leave behind. Paul is about to get radically and wildly provided for in his day and age. He's about to get to ride a horse all the way to Caesarea, about 52 miles. People don't get to ride horses. It's not like here where in America, you're like, your kid shows an interest in horses And you go, we'll go get you some lessons. We'll go down to the Red Barn. We'll find somebody. We know somebody, and we'll ride a horse. No, remember, these people are just trying to get enough calories during the day. Their whole life is based on trying to survive. So Paul's going to get this radical blessing with a 470-person military escort on his way to Rome. And he's going to get to ride a horse to do it. But when he gets to Rome eventually, he'll be slain by Nero. He'll lose his head. So there's a piece of truth here that's very important, and that is that God always provides for his children. Always. But there's also suffering involved in life. And in this case, Paul gets an encouragement. He's not going to die before he gets to Rome. Remember, as we noted last week, he's been caned 3 times already, and he's been whipped 39 lashes 5 times already. So it might not be super encouraging, but the reality is he's going to make it to Rome. God's going to protect him. He's going to be provided for, and he's going to be able to fulfill what God has him doing, and he'll make it to Rome. The other side of this is I think is important is he's going to get to continue to act in the calling that God has given him. Remember, multiple times he opens up the epistle to the Romans, and in different places, multiple times we're told that Paul is the apostle, the commissioned one, the sent one with a mission, the man with a message. Those are all the idea of being an apostle, that he is the apostle to the Gentiles. That's what God called him to do. Remember in Acts 15, one of the things that they settle is that, Paul, you're the guy for the Gentiles, and Peter, you're the guy that's going to go out to the Jews. You're going to kind of lead these ministries, as it were. And so Paul here is getting a encouragement from the Lord that regardless of what's going to happen here, he's going to get to continue in what God has called him to do in his life. And the hard part is we'll read. There's a lot that I'd like to cover today, so we're going to do a lot of reading. And I apologize for that, but I think it'll really help to do the reading because we're going to see the story and how it plays out. There's a real flow to it. But anyway, so Paul getting to fulfill his calling and walk in that is tremendously encouraging to him because he's going to get to give the gospel. He's going to give the gospel to Claudius Lysias. That's the tribune that keeps yanking him out of trouble. Felix is going to get the gospel. Festus is going to get the gospel. Claudius most likely will get the gospel. And it's interesting, if you look through history, Nero, in the beginning, Emperor Nero, he was actually a super reasonable guy. He was kind of a man of the people. He built gymnasiums. He had soup kitchens, all these things for the poor and the needy of Rome. And one of the fascinating things is historically, when Paul finally meets with Nero, and evidently Nero rejects the gospel, that's when Nero really takes off and goes in a wild, violent, terrible direction. It's kind of interesting in that way. But so Paul's going to have plenty of opportunity. His opportunity is going to be rough, though. Because once he has this amazing deliverance and he gets to go to Felix, he gets to go to Caesarea on a horse, he's going to spend at least 2 years in prison. So here's this message of encouragement from God. You're going to go to Rome. You're going to do this. It will be years before he gets to Rome. So what I outlined and what I kind of went through here is the ups and the downs and how those things work out. So I'm going to read them first. I did this in the first service, and I think it worked better than trying to go back to them. So just roll with me for a second. What I titled today is Don't Lose Sight of Your Purpose. So the first thing that happens in verse 13, don't worry about it right now because we'll read it, is that there's a pact. 40 people make a pact to kill Paul. That's a bad thing, right? I mean, that seems, can you imagine if, so what happens is Paul's nephew is going to show up and let him know there's a plot. But can you imagine if someone came to your house tonight and they're like, here's the deal. These people saw you go to church this morning. They're pretty ticked off about it. So 40 of them vowed to never eat or drink until they kill you. Would you be like, oh, that's solid. It's a good Sunday. I think I'll just keep watching some football or do whatever you do on Sunday evening. That'd be pretty alarming, wouldn't it? Maybe like peek out the windows, maybe call 911. Well, there's no 911. There's no Romans coming to save him, per se, although they will. So it's a bad thing. How would we respond to that? Probably fairly negatively. But then something good happens. His nephew shows up and says, hey, these people are going to try to kill him. Something else good happens. The tribune actually listens to him. Something else good happens. He gets the Roman escort to go to Centuria. Then something bad happens. The Claudius Lysias, who writes the letter that goes with him to Felix, lies about what happened. Well, that's bad. That's bad news. How does it feel when someone lies about what happened between you and other people? Feels bad, man, right? It's not a good thing. Then he's going to go to court, and the Jews hire a professional orator. You ever heard lies about yourself in a very eloquent way? That's about what happened. This guy, as a profession, he's kind of a lawyer, but he makes things sound really good. That's who the Jews are going to hire to argue against him. That's a discouraging thing. That's a bad thing. But Paul ends up sharing a truthful defense, and Felix believes him. So that's a good thing. Then Felix keeps him in prison for 2 years so he can do a favor to the Jews. That's a bad thing. So all I'm trying to point out as we go through this, and there's more than that, is that this is how life works, isn't it? Every time you think, oh, this is a good thing, dang it, Felix just keeps you in prison anyway. Multiple times, I think 6 times in the book of Acts, Paul gets declared innocent of being an inciter of riots and a troubler of the people. 6 times. Claudius Lysias tells him that. The Sanhedrin says that. Well, I should say half the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees say that. You have, Galileo says that. The executive governor, the city executive of Ephesus says that. Festus says that. Herod Agrippa II says that. They all say he's innocent. And he still ends up in prison. So it's just, life is rough sometimes. It's hard. There are bad things that happen. But check this out, because I think this is important. In 2 Timothy, there's something important to realize about our life. And that is that regardless of our circumstance, we can excel in life. Regardless of our financial circumstance, regardless of our living circumstance, regardless of our relational circumstance, we don't have to bow down to those circumstances. Now, this is difficult. It's way easier to stand up here or sit there and think, I can do that. It's a whole nother matter to actually walk in it. So we're not trying to oversimplify things or minimize anything. We're just talking about the truth of how powerful Jesus is and what he can do in our lives and what we can choose to do, or I should say, choose to allow him do in our lives. So Paul writes this. So 2 Timothy is the last letter that Paul is going to write before he's slain. And he's writing to Timothy. And these are just things that he's passing on to Timothy in kind of the last days of his life. And he says there in verse 8, he's trying to encourage Timothy. And this is 2 Timothy chapter 1. I don't know if I said 2 by accident. 2 Timothy chapter 1. So he's encouraging Timothy, and he says in verse 8, therefore do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began. I really love this, verse 8 and verse 9. They're one of my favorite verses in the Bible. They're things that I consider just about my own life when I'm doubting, trying to wonder. I'm not trying to wonder. I do wonder. I don't have to try at it. What am I doing in this life? What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? How is my life supposed to look? And all the things that I'm considering, just like you. But when he writes to them, it's interesting because this. Paul writes to Timothy. He says, don't be ashamed. And, that's fine. I think we probably all know that. But he says, share in suffering for the gospel. Share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. So it's not just share in suffering. It's not this generic thing like, hey, go suffer for the gospel. Grab yourself a sign, write something offensive on it, stand out there and yell Jesus, and let's see what happens. That's not what he's saying. It's not just to go suffer for it, but he says suffer for it in or with or of the power of God. In other words, you have a resource that, supersedes, overshadows, invigorates, however you would like to put it or look at it, through God's power, through his Spirit, that you can walk through the suffering. See, for many of us, and we've talked about this a little bit, we become very self-defeated, where something hard comes up, or actually, honestly, even before something hard comes up. And we immediately, in our minds, we see Paul. This is a good example. We'll read the story of Paul, and we'll say this, I could never do that. You ever said that? We've all said that. You don't even have to raise your hand. I could never do that. I could never do that. You know what? You're right. You're right. Because it takes the power of God. And it's something that we have to make sure and be clear about right now in our lives, that we don't exclude that. I'm not talking about negative word or speaking things into existence. I'm just talking about how human beings work. If you convince yourself and you vocalize constantly and you walk in the idea, if you read Paul's testimony and you say, I could never do that, and you walk out that door, you've defeated yourself already. And this isn't like, oh, he's using psychology. No, I'm using reality. That's how it works. If you say, oh, God could not do that in my life or whatever, then you're already done. And you're right. And with all the respect in the world, just hang out for lunch and move on with your life. Because it's a miserable life. And we've all lived it. We've all lived that. So Paul makes this invitation to Timothy. He says, I want to invite you to suffer with me for the gospel, not for being a jerk, but for the gospel, so that you can walk in the power and experience the power that God has for you to walk through that suffering. And we'll talk about some brass tacks and how that works. We'll look at kind of the nuts and bolts of that, as it were. But the second thing he says in relationship to that, the God who saved us, and he called us with a holy calling. God called you. When I first became a Christian, I knew nothing and cared nothing for God's call in my life. Ministry meant nothing to me. I just I got saved. I was kind of just a squirrely 16-year-old kid, really didn't care about much in my life, really had kind of disregarded responsibility and just, I don't know, I was just a weird kid. I was full of anger, full of wrath, violence, and just, I'd given up. And I thought life was completely pointless. And so even after I got saved, I didn't really, I appreciated the forgiveness that I had in Christ, right? Because the simple message of Jesus Christ coming to the earth, loving humanity, going to the cross, shedding his blood for us, literally sacrificing himself, pouring his blood out at Calvary as a sacrifice for his Father, so his Father could forgive us, and then rising from the dead because he literally was the only person who did everything right. Death couldn't hold him. The grave did not have power over him. So he rises from the dead by the power of God. And the fact that you and I can have absolute, complete forgiveness through that message is amazing. And so as a young teen, I appreciated that, the forgiveness. And for me personally, we all have different testimonies. That forgiveness was very real, and it was very exciting to me. But ministry, I was like, I remember going, I was a punk. I still am kind of, but it's a little different. I'm a little better. But I remember being like 16 years old, or probably like 17 years old, and I'd gone to Sundays for a while at this church, and they invited me to a prayer meeting. I was like, church seems pretty cool. Sure, I'll go to this prayer meeting. Why not? I'll check out a prayer meeting. And then it was like an hour and a half of prayer, and I was like, this sucks. Are you kidding me right now? That's literally what I thought to myself. I was like, how do you people sit there for an hour and a half and be quiet? Clearly, I talk a lot. This is crazy. I really thought, somebody asked me, I still remember her name was Marcy. After she came, she said, what do you think of the prayer meeting? I was like, that sucked. I was not into that at all. Yeah, honesty can be rough sometimes. So I look back on that actually with tremendous regret. But the point is that I had no idea about calling. I didn't know the purpose of prayer. I didn't know why I would want to interact with that. I didn't know why I would want to serve Jesus. I didn't know why I would want any of that. It had no relation for me. And so something when I was about 18 changed in my life. I went down to this a Bible conference that I also was torn about because it was really long and long meetings and whatever. But there was an instance where the Lord spoke to my heart. And it was out of David's message to Solomon. And it's not a macho thing or something like that, but David is about to die, and he pulls Solomon aside. And he says, look, Solomon, I'm about to die, his son Solomon. And he says, be strong and show yourself a man to obey the Lord in all that he calls you to do. And in that point in my life, as about an 18-year-old kid, the Lord ministered to my heart, James, here's the deal. You either need to follow me, legit follow me, or you need to go away. Because what you got going on right now, this whole fence thing, is pretty worthless for both of us. You're not really being involved in my kingdom, and you're just living a guilty, miserable life. And so it was a kind of a wild thing that occurred in my life. And so I remember in that very moment, in that meeting, just praying and saying, Lord, I don't think I can actually live the life you want me to live. I don't think I have that strength. I definitely don't have the desire all the time. And it just seems, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. But I heard what you said, and I'll follow you for my whole life. But you have to do it because I know me. I'm full of all sorts of not goodness. And so I need you to work in my heart. So there's something that's very important for each one of us, that God has not only saved you, but he called you. It's a holy calling. I mean, it's a calling that's separate from everything else. Holiness is not like a big white hat with a golden cross on it. Holiness is the idea that you are set aside for something, in this case, for the Lord. Not set aside like be holy. It doesn't mean I've called you to be a prude or I've called you to reject anything that's fun. You know, all the things that we associate with holiness. It literally just means to be set aside for God. And the implication there is relationship. To know him, to experience him in his word, at church, among other believers, all the places that we experience his fidelity, in prison, in court, wherever it might be. That's what he's calling us to. You have a holy calling. And it says it's not according to your works. You didn't earn this calling. He didn't evaluate you for a few years after you got saved and then say, you know what, now I'll call you to my service. No, it's a calling that's based upon his grace, is what we'll read here. His grace that is able to empower you, cleanse you, work in you, speak to you. He says he has a calling for you. So it's noteworthy that this encouragement that Paul gets right before he's about to go to prison for 2.5 years-ish, is like, I'm not done with you, and I'm not done with your calling. You're going to go to Rome from me. And then I just want to pass that on to us as we're reading this and looking at this story and considering it, the story we have not yet read, that he is, that it's with this backdrop that he's now about to launch into this story. And so it is with us, and whatever you're about to launch into in life, whatever, tomorrow is a Monday morning and you'll go to work or school, I guess it's summertime, but you're going to have responsibility and there's things that you're going to need to do and all these things. That God has a calling for your life, and the encouragement that God has for you is not that nothing bad will happen. That is not an encouragement. That's not an encouragement for anyone, because it's a lie, right? It's a lie. When somebody comes along and says, it'll be all right, it will. But not because your situation will always be wonderful. It'll be all right because God will always be in your situation. He'll be with you. He'll care for you. But it'll always be as you let him, because he's a gentleman, and he's not going to force his life and his calling on you. He's going to continue to invite you to partake in it. It's why in the Psalms, David says, taste and see that the Lord is good. You can observe all sorts of things, but until you taste it for yourself, until you know and invite him into your life, and I do into mine, in the most difficult of times, we'll never know. We'll never know. And so the invitation that we have in what Paul's about to experience, and we can experience with him, and then hopefully apply to our own lives, is that God is with him throughout. And sometimes it's blessing, and sometimes it's letdown. But God is always there. And so as we kick off here in verse 12, in chapter 23 of Acts, verse 12, when it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now the word oath there, just as for context, it's where we get our word, English word anathema, to be accursed. So the oath that they're making is literally, may we go to hell if we don't kill Paul. So fairly serious, I suppose. He says, there were more than 40 who made this conspiracy, and they went to the chief priests and the elders, and they said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And when we are ready to kill him, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So they say, hey, we've made an oath. We've said, may we go to hell if we don't kill Paul, and we're not going to eat or drink until we do it. Personally, I would have just keep eating and drinking and just gone with the go to hell part, but maybe inversely, clearly. But so Paul here, there are these people here, they say, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is what we need you to do. We need you, the Sanhedrin, to go to Claudius Lysias, that's the tribune, and we need you to tell him that you want to ask him more questions. And so when they bring him down, when the tribune brings him down 40 of us are going to kill him before he even gets near to this place where you're going to question him. Does that make sense? And so that's why there's 40 of them. They're going to die. A lot of them are going to die because they're going to face armed Roman guards bringing him down. But they say it's worth it to die to do this. Verse 16, now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. So he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, what is it that you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, tell no one that you have informed me of these things. So here you are, you're Paul, you're in prison. You're kind of waiting to see what happens. You just called out in the middle of a gathering, caused a bunch of chaos, a riot. They pulled you out of there. You spend one night in jail. The next night the Lord appears to you. And in that morning, this plot is hatched. That evening, somehow his nephew finds out about the plot, goes to visit Paul, and then Paul, the nephew tells Paul, hey, this is what's going to go down. Paul grabs the centurion, says, hey, will you bring this boy to the tribune, Claudius Lysias, so that he can know what's going on. There's a few miracles here that occur. Number one, Paul's nephew finds out. Paul has a sister. That's kind of interesting. I don't think it's kind of neither here nor there for us, but Paul has family. Family create ties, traditionally, right? When you suffer singly, it's a lot easier than when you have family. But he's got a sister. Sister has a nephew. And the nephew somehow finds out about this. Maybe he's in the temple. Maybe the nephew's, playing double agent. Maybe the nephew's just trying to figure out what his life is about, if he's going to be a Pharisee, if he's going to be a Christian and follow the way or whatever. But his nephew finds out, comes to Paul. Paul grabs the centurion. Here's a second miracle. The centurion listens to him. This is Rome. They hate Jews. The Jewish people have been some of the most contrary, rebellious people that they've ever conquered. They do not like the Jews. Now, this is later on because Felix, I can't remember the exact dates, but Felix was the governor from like 52 AD to like 58 AD. And then after him is Festus. Yeah, something like that. Anyway, so Felix is 2 governors after Pontius Pilate. Does that make sense? So Pontius Pilate was like 46 to 52, and then Festus is 52 to 56, and then, Felix, and then Festus is 56 for like 4 more years. The point being is that you've got all these Roman governors. Pontius Pilate is removed because he used to incite riot all the time by pestering the Jews and kind of pushing their buttons by mingling their blood with pig's blood, by marching their idols down the center of Jerusalem. He did all sorts of things that were bad, and eventually he was removed from power, as Felix will be. But in this case, this centurion willingly takes Paul's nephew to the tribune. And the tribune willingly listens to, it says kid, it's actually the Greek word there is like somebody who's in their 20s. So listens to this guy, this Jewish guy, that he has no reason to listen to, that he cares nothing for, and listens to him, and then acts on it. This is divine intervention. This is God watching over Paul, making sure that he's going to fulfill what God has him to do, the most fulfilling thing he could do. Sitting in prison, having an up and down. I mean, first you're like, oh, man, I caused a riot. Oh, thank goodness I'm delivered. Oh, the Lord appeared to me. Oh, 40 people are trying to kill me. Oh, I'm being delivered. Oh, I'm in prison. I mean, think about that. That's a heck of a week, We're like, oh, man, my cat peed on the bed. I don't know what I'm going to do, That happened to us this week. It's like the end of the world. Paul's like, am I going to die or am I going to be in prison or both? But so this is this crazy up and down thing. But God is preserving something. He's doing something here. He's working this out, and it actually gets even better. Verse 23, then he called, this is the tribune, he called 2 of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers and 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter to this effect. So the tribune says, here's what we're going to do. And he rallies 470 troops. Just for context, the believed population of Nazareth at this time, Jesus' hometown, is like 350 to 400. So he has rallied more Roman troops to transport Paul than Jesus has in his hometown. And not only that, he's going to get to ride a horse. You know, the interesting thing, they historically, this years ago I read about this, and they actually have you can look at a picture of it on the internet. They actually have a pay stub from a Roman cavalryman from the first century. And the Roman cavalryman in the first century had to pay for his own sandals out of his money. He paid for his own saddle for his horse. He paid for all the tackle for his horse, and he paid for all the feed of his horse. This particular soldier, this particular month on his pay stub, he made 0 drachma because everything he made from his paycheck from being a soldier was taken to feed his horse and to take care of it. Now someone's horse, out of their own money, is now Paul's. I mean, this is like luxury. They're going to ride and walk 37 miles. And the 3rd hour of the night is about 9 p.m. So they're starting their 37-mile trek, because Caesarea is actually like 52 miles. So they're not going to make it all there in the first night. They're going to go, and the first section of their first leg of their walk is 37 miles. And Paul is going to be in the middle. I mean, if I was Paul, I'd be feeling a little bit self-conscious, because you know that those 400, the 200 soldiers and the 200 spearmen are like, are you kidding me right now? We're taking this little Jewish dude in the middle of the night because the other Jews want to kill him to Caesarea? Are you kidding me right now? And he's riding a horse? I mean, I'd be like, oh, sorry, guys. Did you want to ride? Can we trade? But that's the luxury that he's walking in, or that he's riding in, I guess, as it were. Like, God is supernaturally providing for him at this point. And I think it's important to note that, you know, if you need a horse, God's going to give you a horse. If you can't walk those 37 miles, God's going to provide a way for it. For whatever reason, in this instance, he says, Paul, you need a horse. And he got one. It's amazing. It's incredible. This is completely out of the ordinary that he should be able to be issued a horse to be able to ride these 37 miles and be in for as much as possible, absolute and complete safety, to be the focal point of a 470 some odd man adventure, you know, up to Caesarea. It's absolutely incredible historically. So then Claudius Lysias writes a letter because he was required to. Anytime you pass someone along to someone who is a superior, you had to give a written explanation of why you were doing it. Verse 26. So Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him. Having learned that he was a Roman citizen, and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So he writes a letter, and he lies. Isn't this interesting? It's politics, man. I mean, Rome is no different than today. Because Claudius Lysias, he writes, hey, Felix, here's what happened. I was chilling in the Praetorium, and then there was this big riot, and then I found out that the riot was over a Roman citizen. And I was like, oh, not on my watch. And so I rushed in and I saved a Roman citizen from a riot. Right? What actually happened? Some dude's in a riot getting beat to a pulp. They rush in, they grab him. They can't figure out why he's getting beat to a pulp, so they stretch him out to flog him. And then Paul turns to the centurion and is like, I'm a citizen. And they're all like, oh, no, you're a citizen? Paul's like, yep. And so they untie him. And then they're like, okay, this is not good. Because if you flog a Roman citizen without him being condemned, you get flogged. It was a crime. It was a big deal to punish a Roman citizen. So Claudius Lysias, when he's writing the letter, he conveniently is like, yeah, I found out he was a citizen, so I rescued him. It's cool. And then he says he's innocent. So it's to me, why include this in this? We're reading it because it's here, but in this particular teaching, have you ever had a weird conscience about someone who's lying around you? And you know it? Makes you feel weird, right? And then you get into like a conundrum of faith. Well, should I narc him out for it? Do I tell somebody? Do I not tell somebody? Am I culpable if I don't tell somebody? Should I go and tell Felix that actually this guy Claudius Lysias, who's been really nice to me and didn't flog me, that he's lying to him? Ever felt that? I have. I don't know. Maybe I have an overactive conscience. I don't know. But the point is that'd be stressful. It would for me anyway. Maybe not for you. It'd be stressful for me to know like this guy's lying about what happened. And now I'm going to stand before Felix, and he's going to ask me what happened. What if it comes out in the truth, and now Claudius Lysias just decides, you're done? It's just scary stuff. It's up and it's down. It's up. Oh, I'm on a horse. Oh, Claudius Lysias is lying about me. Oh, it's Felix. He's going to give me justice. Oh, I'm in prison for 2 years. It's a rough go. But it doesn't change who God is, and it doesn't change our calling, and it doesn't change what God can do in our lives if we continue to let him work. And we'll read a great verse about that in the end here. So the letter comes out in verse 31. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Now, Antipatris is not a person. It is a place. And it's that middle ground. Oh, not middle. It's 37 miles north of Jerusalem and like 24, 25 miles south of Caesarea, or 18, anyway, right around there. It says, and they delivered the letter to the governor, and they presented Paul also before him. And on reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So if you want to, I encourage you, go ahead and research why he asked. He asked where he was from. It's not what province, it's what sort of province would be the literal English translation there. And really, he's asking because he's trying to punt Paul. He's trying to get rid of him. Felix is a very interesting person. Felix was born a slave in the Roman government, or in the Roman country. So he was born, if you're into history at all, this is fascinating about how Felix gets to where he's at. So Felix, and I believe his other friend, his name is Maulus, or his other slave friend, Maulus or Paulus, I can't remember which. But basically, you have Claudius, right? So here's Claudius, he's currently Caesar. Claudius' mother had 2 slaves, Felix and Maulus. Claudius grew up with Felix and Maulus as his slaves that his mother owned. Does that make sense? So he grew up with them. They helped raise Claudius, the emperor, the would-be emperor. Claudius, when he rises to be the emperor, because he liked Felix and Maulus, or Paulus, forgive me, my plan is to have the chart next week because it's like this big and it's crazy. But essentially, he likes them. They were kind to him when he grew up because they were slaves. So he buys their freedom when he becomes emperor. He just says, you're free men now. You're not slaves anymore. And you get to be governor. Yay! It's like the literal rags to riches of the ages. So there's another man, and his name is Tacitus, and he was a historian, one of the most reliable Roman historians. And he lived from about 56 AD to about 120 AD. And Tacitus makes a comment about Felix. And the comment that he makes is that Felix wielded the power of the state like he was still a slave. In other words, Felix was incredibly violent. And he was incredibly vengeful. And he was just mad with power and with anger. And he was one of the most ruthless governors, I should say, and one of the most cold human beings, and how cruel he could be to people and how he would have them slain and whatnot. So this is the Felix that he's now in front of. Does that make sense? So it's a pretty radical situation. So Felix says, here's what we're going to do. You're here. You're going to be in this. I'm going to keep you in Herod's praetorium, and then you need to. We'll send for the high priest. They're going to come up here to Caesarea, and then we'll try you here in Caesarea, and they can make their accusations. So 5 days later, they show up. It says, and this is. It says there in verse 1, and after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. And they laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, and we'll read that in a moment. Tertullus is literally a paid professional orator. So he's kind of a lawyer, but realistically, his job is to make everything sound great. Once again, it's politics. I mean, right? This is like what we live in today, only we don't get killed if we don't like it. So in this, they get together, they hire this guy Tertullus, and this is what he says. Since through you we enjoy much peace. Lie. Absolute lie. Now Festus was married to Drusilla, and she was a Jew. And again, we'll get the chart out hopefully next week and be able to talk about that. And so Felix, I keep saying Festus. Felix is married to Drusilla, and she is a Hellenistic Jew. She's adopted some Jewish customs. Not entirely, because she was married and then gets taken by Felix away, and she's like the daughter of Herod Agrippa II. So it's all keeping it in the family, as it were. So he's got this Jewish tie with Drusilla, so he's favorable to the Jews. He's favorable to the Jews because he doesn't want to tick off Claudius, just as Pontius Pilate lost his position because he ticked off the I can't remember the Caesar when he was there, but he did poorly and was removed. And so Felix does not want to get in trouble with the honchos in Rome, and he doesn't want to get in trouble with his wife. And so it's all this whole loaded scenario. Like the cards are stacked against him. Does that make sense? Like there's all this reason why Felix would never judge for Paul. And now you have Tertullus who's up there, liar, liar, pants on fire. And he says there, since though we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation. Yeah, reforms. In every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. You're like, okay, wow. Get my hip boots. Verse 4, but to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness and to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. There's a few things about this. Number one, these accusations play right to Felix, right? Because Felix is going to be favorable to the Jews because he has a Jewish wife, and it doesn't behoove him to make them angry and to cause a riot because he'll be removed. He'll be chastised by Claudius. So you have these accusations that basically work on three things: him personally, and then also politically. Because they say, if you recall, the accusation was, this guy stirs up riots everywhere he goes. So that's bad for Felix, right? Because if you have someone who's stirring up riots, it looks like there's unrest in your area that you're governing. That gets back to Rome, and all of a sudden you're in hot water again. And there's a third, and this might even be the worst. They say that he is the leader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, the word sect here in the Greek is where we get our word heresy, right? And a heresy for us, for English, when we're talking about it in the church, is any teaching that attacks or maligns the person of Jesus or what he did at the cross, right? So a heresy isn't we believe in tongues, we don't. A heresy is Jesus didn't bodily raise from the dead. That would be a heresy. A heresy would be that Christ didn't actually die. It's an attack on what he did at the cross. Does that make sense? So when Tertullus is now communicating, he's saying not that this is just some other section of Jews. He's making the point, these guys aren't Jews. They're a heresy of Judaism. Why does that matter? Because you were not allowed to practice any religion that was not approved by the Roman government. And Christianity was not approved by the Roman government, but Judaism was. Up until this point, and for a few years after this, Christianity will still be legal in Rome because it's looked at by Romans as being part of the Jewish faith. Once they finally detach it and say legally, no, this is not Judaism anymore, this is Christianity, that's where you're going to see guys like Domitian and Titus. They're going to, over the span of about 150 years, are going to kill hundreds of millions of Christians because they begin to just weed it out of Rome for as much as they can. So this is the beginning of something that's actually incredibly destructive, this idea that this accusation that Christianity is not part of Judaism, which it was born out of Judaism, and that's about where it ends. So, having said that, verse 9, the Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. Again, this is a major, just put yourself in this position. It feels bad enough when you have an issue with one person, doesn't it? Like for example, if you know that you have beef with someone at church, it makes it stressful to go to church, doesn't it? If you know that there's one person that you don't agree with or you're having an issue with and you haven't worked it through for whatever reason, like sometimes we won't even go to church. We'll avoid it. I'm not trying to make a statement here. I'm just saying in this position, this is a whole group of people that hate him, want to kill him, and then you have a whole other section of people that are like, yeah, and another thing. It's discouraging. It stinks to be hated. It especially stinks to be hated if you're like, I'm just trying to help you. I care about you. That's where Paul's at. Again, we're trying to go from this, the up and down, just the craziness of life, to more like, okay, how can I address each bad and good thing that occurs in my life, filtering it through what God's working in me and what he can do in me, rather than responding to each crazy thing that happens with just some outlandish emotional response. And here we're watching Paul, and here we really see, because he's going to reply. In verse 10, and when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have judged over this nation. True statement. I cheerfully make my address. True statement. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. That's a rough 12 days. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be no resurrection, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience towards God and man. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. And while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and make your accusation, should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. Other than this one thing, that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. So Paul gives his rebuttal, and he's making true statements. He says, you've ruled here for a long time. That's a true statement. He's being diplomatic. He says, I'm glad I get to give you a defense, right? He's not lying. He's not saying, you're doing a great job. I really appreciate what you do here. He's saying, hey, this is where we're at. See, remember, and I think I mentioned this a couple teachings ago, there's a website, I wish I could remember the name of it, I think I have it on my favorites, where you can go back and you can actually read through the 2nd and 3rd century, you can read the letters that Christians were writing to these Caesars. It's incredible because they write and they start off and they say, "O wise Caesar," and intelligent Caesar, philosopher Caesar, please stop throwing us to the lions. This is why we worship the way we do. So there's a difference between lying and just being courteous. And Paul here, he doesn't freak out. He doesn't have a rager. He doesn't have a meltdown. He knows that God is with him. He knows that he's going to Rome. He knows that he's got a calling on his life. And so he says, here's what's going down. This is what they said. This is the truth of the matter. He brings up the law. The law in Rome was that if you accused somebody, you had to actually be there. So these Jews in Asia that made up the fact of him profaning the temple, the Tertullus references, they're not even there. So they can't even actually make that accusation legally against Paul. Does that make sense? So that's what this whole thing is, a giant sham. This is the bad part. I mean, if sitting in that courtroom must have been at least tempting to just be discouraged and to wail and to, what is happening to me? Why is it going this way? Why won't the truth come out? Why won't this be different? Because he's on a mission. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately. We can get really wrapped up in kind of the whodunit of life. Not just when people wrong us, but it's funny because like sometimes somebody will say something, and I'm not trying to be accusatory here, so hear me out. But we'll say something like, I was trying to get to church, but I was late. Satan was trying to stop me. Right? But then we'll find out, there was a huge accident, and I didn't get in it. God was delivering me. I didn't get in the accident. Right? It's like we go to this like back and forth, like whose fault is it? Am I sick because I'm naughty and God's made me sick? Or is it Satan oppressing me and I need to rebuke him? Which is it? Who did it? And we get all wound up. And depending on our personality, that's usually who we side with. Right? So if we're negative like me, we're like, this is all Satan or it's all my fault. If you're like super positive, you're like, oh, God's just keeping me. This is so great. But there's like this weird dilemma. Like we have to find out what's every motive. Who did this? Like it's some sort of closure in our lives. When in reality, other than the fact that knowing that Satan hates you and wants to destroy your life, he comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So everything born out of this world and its system is rotten. Other than knowing that, it doesn't matter why it happened. It literally does not matter. It just mattered that it did happen. And now how am I going to deal with it? If I'm late to church and I get in this weird, fantastical thing about Satan oppressing me, that's going to put me in a certain mindset, isn't it? If I just go, well, I'm late to church, I guess I should have brushed my teeth faster or whatever, then I can just go and I don't have to worry about it. Because be it Satan or me or the world or God or some other whatever, it becomes irrelevant because I know God can use it. All that matters in the situation now is how do I respond to it? Even if Satan has some sort of cosmic plan to make you late for church, it's okay. You can still get here. You can still talk to people after the handshake. You can, hang out afterwards. I'm not trying to be trite, but this is, don't we get in these weird things? Well, we'll get all bummed out and be like, he's just out there and he's just kicking my Glutius Maximus and he's just, all this stuff, right? Greater is he that is in you, that is in the world. Satan's got plans. He wants to destroy you. It's cool. It's how things go. We don't have to sweat it. Because God is going to work anything that happens to us, he's going to work it out. And even in the most terrible of sufferings, we can experience the true joys. We can experience God coming through for us. Even up to the moment that we're beheaded by Nero, as it were. I was talking to a guy earlier this week, and I'd forgotten about this book. There's a great book. It's great for nighttime reading. It's Fox's Book of Martyrs. It was written in about 1536, something like that, 1563. And it's Protestant accounts of people that have been martyred for the faith. And when you read those accounts, it's nuts what these men and women went through. And the fact that there's literally people in there, they're being burnt at the stake. And they're bubbling up, and their hands are up, and they're just singing hymns as they finally slump over and just fall into the flames. Families tied to the stake, burnt right there for teaching their kids the Lord's Prayer in English English or Greek. Translators, the people that wanted to bring the Bible out of Latin into Greek, by the tens, burnt at the stake, singing. One of my favorites is William Tyndale. Some of you guys might have Tyndale Press, right? Tyndale Press Bibles. He got arrested for translating the Bible into Greek. Him and his buddies used to sit in a pub, drink beer, and translate the Bible into Greek. And he got caught. He got sold out by one of his guys. And he stood before the tribune that were there to charge him for it. And after they condemned him guilty to be burnt, they're walking him out to the stake. And by all accounts, he breaks free from the guards and runs to the stake and just hugs it and just grabs it. And they stacked the wood around him. They never had to chain him. They finally put a chain around his waist so he wouldn't fall off. And he just sat there and hugged it, and they touched it off. And he died singing hymns to the glory of God. That's who William Tyndale is. It was William Tyndale who would shout, "Lord, open the eyes of the king," as he's burning at the stake. Yeah, some wild stuff. Some wild stuff. So it's pretty amazing what God can do in a life and what he can bring us through. The most worst possibility that we think, there's no way I can come back from that. Where God says, no, I can use that. And I can bring you through it. He's going to go on, and this is perhaps one of the most sad parts, but Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off. So Felix understands what Christianity is, and he just tells the accusers, go away. And he says, when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Legally, there's really no reason for this. So Felix just kind of puts them off. Realistically, from some things that get said in 25 and 26, chapters 25 and 26, Felix doesn't think he's guilty. He knows he's not guilty. But he says there, I'm going to put this off till Lysias comes down, so I'll buy him more time. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody and have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending his needs. So here, it's good and bad. He's still in custody. He's perfectly innocent. Every single tribune that he's been to up to this point has said, this guy is innocent. And Felix keeps him in custody. Felix thinks he's innocent too. He keeps him in custody, but he gets to have friends visit him. It's good and bad. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. And at the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. How disheartening would that be? You're innocent. You know you're innocent. Everybody is saying you're innocent. But because of politics and relationships and religion, you are stuck in prison. But your ministry is not dead. Your purpose is not dead. Your calling is not dead. None of that is hindered. The word of God is still going forward. God is still ministering to him. He even tried to minister to Felix. He was fearful. We'll talk maybe more about Felix if you read his history. How he got Drusilla for wife is scandalous. And here Paul is telling him the gospel and about self-control and righteousness. And Felix is so bothered, he just says, go away. I can't hear this anymore. And Felix has like this weird duality, this stuckness. He's listening to Paul, and he's convicted by his message, but he also wants to get money. And so he's hoping Paul will bribe him. And he keeps calling Paul back again and again, often. I don't know what often is, but that would tick me off. Like, I'm not giving you money. Where do you think I'm going to get money from, Felix? Yeah. Insert weird TV evangelist joke here. But, it's just, where am I going to get this money from? But I'll keep giving you the gospel. I'll keep walking in this. I'll keep doing this. And that's what he does. And then he gets left in prison for it. And Festus doesn't do him any favors when he takes over. We're a little bit over time. We'll give me about 3 more minutes. I just want to read a couple more verses here. I think for many of us, including myself sometimes, maybe all the time, we get stuck. We're just like Felix, only not so much about salvation, about where we're going in life. Where we see Christ, and we desire that literally with our hearts and our minds, and we say, that is what I want. But then we have these other desires and things that we go through. And in Felix's case, it's money. For us, it can be the cares of this life. It can be a relationship. It can be an identity. It can be a myriad of things where God says, I'm calling you to something great. And we say, I want that so much. But this thing, my own, my precious, the thing that I want, the thing that I covet, the thing that's so important to me. And meanwhile, God's calling us, and we want to leave it behind. As Paul would say, the good that we would do, we don't do. And that which we would not do, that's what we find ourselves doing. Just this absolute craziness of the fallen flesh versus the calling of the Holy Spirit in our life. So how do we deal with that? How do we walk through that? It's baby steps. It really is. It's not just, I'm going to be different tomorrow. How many of us, you don't have to raise your hand, how many of us are just going to be different tomorrow? How many times have you just going to be different tomorrow? I don't know about probably hundreds of thousands for me. I don't know how many days I've been on the earth, but probably every day. Tomorrow will be different. And then you wake up, and it's not. Or you wake up and have a few good days, and it is. And then you fall back into that same self that you feel like you've been. And it just feels like this terrible, tumultuous washing machine of Christianity. So how do we deal with that in our hearts, where we see that God is doing something and we move in it? Paul, he writes this, he's talking about ministry and a lot of other things, so forgive me for jumping into the middle of a thought here. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, talking about the fact that we have a treasure in our own bodies, and it's the knowledge, the knowledge is like the intimate relationship, the intimate knowing of Christ, of God in the face of Christ, and now he shines out of us. And then he starts talking about tribulations. And then in verse 16, he says this, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So this is an underliner, I think, for me, but this idea. He says, look, we don't lose heart because our inner self is being renewed, being made new, being refreshed, right? Being strengthened, however you'd like to look at that. But then he makes a qualifier here. He says, for this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, which that would probably be absolutely worth breaking down, but I've already used my 3 minutes. And in verse 18, he says, as we look not to the things that are seen. Now this, as we look, in the Greek, this is the present active, which means this, as we continue to look. The idea is it's the voice that signifies it's an action that is happening and there's no cease in sight for that action. Does that make sense? In other words, it's a qualifier. As we look to the things that are not seen. See, if we have, I'll give you an example, quick example. This morning, I was driving down here, and there was a memorial here yesterday, and so somebody borrowed my key, and I told her, I said, just take my key, and I'll get my wife's key to get into the church this morning, which I don't know why I did that, because I already knew I would forget. But this time, new leaf, new day, I'm not going to forget. I'm doing it, right? I'm just a forgetful person for a lot of things. And so I get all the way down. I get to Napa Auto Parts. I live up by off of Cranberry Road. I get to Napa Auto Parts, and I'm like, I didn't bring the key. So I turn around, and I text my wife and say, hey, I forgot the key. I'm on my way back up. And so she goes, do you want me to meet you somewhere? And I'm like, I'll just keep driving, and if I see you, I'll stop you. Whatever. Sounds like a plan. So I drive up there. And I remember, after I texted while I was driving, I said, yeah, it happened. It was voice to text. Does that matter? Does that save me? I was doing this. I wasn't doing this. I was doing this. So I'm justified to break the law. God bless you guys. So I'm driving up, and I just had this big sigh, like a child or something. I was just because I was stressed out. I'm not stressed out, but that put stress on me because I was like, I need to finish my notes. I got stuff to do. I want to get this done. And now this is going to give me 15 more minutes. So I have this very small occurrence in my life, right? But it immediately evokes anxiety. How am I going to get my notes finished? If I don't get these notes finished, I'll give a terrible sermon. And then people will leave the church and I'll get fired and I'll go work at McDonald's or something. Like, you know what I mean? Like this huge radical chain of events that there's absolutely no evidence for, right? Or, and by the grace of God, I didn't do this time, but I have done it in the past. When we get stressed or we get angry, we blame other people. And I could have been like, why did that guy ask me for my key? I didn't do that, but I could have. I could have been like, what? Somebody should have reminded me. Like, who would remind you, Jay? I don't know, but you know what I'm saying? Like, we start to blame other people. Well, that shouldn't have happened. I could have written a note. I could have gotten the key the second my wife got home from where she was. There was a million things I could have done, but I didn't do them. And so I have a choice. I can, in that moment, go, oh, you know what? God will provide for this. It'll be okay. I'll lose 20 minutes of my morning. It'll be okay. Or I can go to the flesh and just have the meltdown. It won't be okay. My life is going to end because I forgot the key. You know, all my children will starve. You know, just all these things, right? I don't know about you, but that's how I roll often. And I think at the end of the day, what the Lord wants for us is to move away from this perpetual looking at the things that are seen, the transient. The transient. Keys are transient. Jobs are transient. They're transient. They're going to burn someday. They're going away someday. But our lives with one another, our relationship with one another, our relationship with Christ, those things are eternal. And they're only getting sweeter. So as we look, when you have something discouraging or angering or anxiety occur in your life, whether it's not having a key or losing a loved one, we need to continue to move forward and say, not what is this situation going to do to me, but what is God going to do in the situation? How can I move forward with power? He will miraculously supply you with what you need. He promised it. He promised he would do that. So we need to take a step back in those moments and go, okay, this is the time that I taste and see. This is the time where I put the brakes on the emotional freak out and I say, my kids are probably going to keep eating. I can just go pick up the key and God will make up the time for me and I'll be able to type my notes out. It's going to be okay. One day, Paul will lose his head to Nero and he will have run his course and he'll be with the Lord. One day, we will die or we will be raptured. But Christ is coming back. He has a calling for your life, and he has every single thing you need to walk in as you look to the unseen. He will not let you down. You have not screwed up your life to a point that you cannot walk with him and have everything that he has for you. He has a great calling for each one of you to great ministries. And we don't want to take steps in our life to self-defeat or to allow room for our flesh or Satan or the boogeyman or whoever to control us. We want to invite the Holy Spirit, and we want to see and let God do what he's going to do. And none of us will ever be disappointed. So we'll end with that. God bless you guys. I hope that this has encouraged you and that you can move forward. You know, if you want to pray, I'll be up here for prayer. Others will be up here for prayer. We would love to pray with you. And I want to say, with all the respect and the love in the world, that if you feel stuck and you walk out of here doing nothing, it's on you. And that's not punitive or condemnation. That's not my heart. My heart is that don't make a decision today that costs you life and joy. Don't do it. But pray with your neighbor, pray with one of us, pray with yourself. I mean, there's no magic potion here, but seek the Lord. Father, thank you for your great grace. Thank you for the cloud of witnesses that went beforehand. Thank you that Paul can witness to your grace and your kindness, and so can we. And we pray, Lord, that you would continue to work in our own hearts and do great things. Lord, we commit ourselves to you. We're asking for your blessing and your Spirit to abide with us, and we would know your presence as we drive home, as we spend time with one another or by ourselves tonight or whatever we're doing. But Lord, that you would do great things in our hearts and we would respond. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, God bless you guys.